Thank you. Hi there. I'm happy to be here, and I have been speaking at these first Wednesdays for years, but in these recent years, I have been speaking about Buddhism and the application of Buddhism to everyday life. And so that's probably what I've done for the last 4 or 5 of these events that I've done. So I'm launching off into what looks like a different topic tonight, but actually it really does relate a great deal to the way that I look at the importance of love, particularly, as I'll be talking about it, love between equals in this period of time. Obviously, we're in a period of time where some of the greatest spiritual difficulties come from conflict. Conflicts that are unresolved, unspeakable, where people are not able to talk about the differences that they have in opinion because they have so much feeling, so much emotion that disrupts them. And they have a problem, most of us do, with what's called projection, which is the tendency to see what's disavowed in yourself in another person. And so these difficulties that we have with dealing with conflict are actually intensified in our families. And I think that if we were to come to a place where we could use the skills of dialogue and witnessing in dealing with our closest relationships, particularly those relationships we're supposed to love the other person. That would be with our partners, our parents, and our children, sometimes our siblings too. Maybe you don't feel you're supposed to love your siblings, but in any case, they're there. And they're sort of among the people that you got onto the elevator with at some point, and you were stuck with them for the rest of your life. But the people that are closest to us are the people that we have a tendency to download into most readily, and then to become really agitated and disrupted by in our conflicts. So I see the applications of mindfulness in everyday life to actually be in the area of love between equals as a leading edge in the development of what I hope to be perhaps a new chapter in human relating. I do not believe that we are going to achieve any kind of greater understanding, compassion, or wisdom by legislating differences in terms of how people use pronouns or how they are allowed to speak or touch each other. I think those kinds of changes have to really come from within, and I think that a great place to start is your family. A lot of times when I go out to do Buddhist talks, people say to me, well, why is world peace so difficult? You know, it seems so straightforward that we really wouldn't want to kill each other. And I usually say, well, how's it going in your family? Like, how many people in your family are really able to sit down together and talk out their differences? So I hope you can see what I'm going to present tonight, not simply in the framework of falling in love and couple relationship, which I am going to talk about, but in this larger framework in which we have ideals of equality and reciprocity and mutuality, where we want to be equals, and yet we can't seem to get through our conflicts in a way that sustains respect and openness for the other. So, you know, I'd like you to think about your own relationships, and then also to think in a bigger way about what's happening right now in our society and where we're stuck. And we seem really, really stuck around the issues of what I would call important differences between people. So does that all make sense to you? Make sense? So there are going to be some different, let's say, items in the program, and the first one is a video of me, no less. So you're going to see me here and you're going to see me on the video. But this video is actually a very good summary and gives a background for the talk that I'm going to give, and I'm actually going to read a lot of the talk. I don't like doing that, but this material is very fresh for me. So I have a book that's coming out in January 2019 called Love Between Equals, and I'm going to actually be reading from that book tonight. So it ends up that it's more cogent if I read it to you than if I try to tell it to you, where I'll go into all sorts of diversions. So we're going to watch the video. I'm going to check in with you a little bit about what you see there in the video, and then I am going to read a little bit. And what I'm going to read about is this tremendous shift that has happened recently. Really, it's been in the last 50 years or so in the institution of marriage, and how that has affected us in terms of the way that we understand our commitment to being with another person through the thick and the thin of it, okay? And then after I do that reading, we'll have plenty of time, I'm sure, for conversation. Couple relationship in the 21st century is really very, very difficult. We made 3 wishes for intimate relationship, and we got all 3 of them. The first wish was to have a relationship that was equal, reciprocal, mutual, that had the kind of eye-to-eye connection, rather than one person being above the other. And the second wish was that we would be able to fall in love and choose a partner no matter how different that partner might be from what our families wanted or what our tradition was. And the third wish was to have a partner who would know us and see us, who could be a witness, who could say, I really do see who you are, and that we could do that for the other person, so that there would be that feeling that we are known, that we're seen. So those 3 wishes we got. And it turned out that they made committed long-term relationships more difficult, not easier. What we don't understand and what we haven't been able to come to terms with is how difficult it is to live in a family without hierarchy, without someone being in charge, and how difficult it is to negotiate conflicts with someone who's supposed to be an equal, where we're supposed to have mutual responsibility for the decision making, and with somebody who's supposed to know us personally, so that we take it personally what they say about us, and somebody who is actually a part of what really counts in our life. So this setup leads to repetitive conflict, difficulties with power struggle, and ultimately, and this seems almost ironic, it leads to the feeling of being with an enemy, like an intimate enemy, somebody who knows you well and who actually does so many things that are painful to you, and you're not sure why, and you're not sure how to overcome that, because when you try to explain yourself, or when you get into questioning, that tends to lead to defensiveness on both your partner's part and your own part. So when we look back to our parents' marriages, or to the marriages that we might have even idealized, we really can't be sure that they were dealing with the same kind of thing, because they probably weren't in a reciprocal, mutual, equal. They probably weren't trying to be best friends. They probably weren't sort of looking at the other person thinking, does this meet my need for happiness? In the past, say in my parents' lives, my parents stayed with each other because they got married in church and their families expected them to stay. They didn't take it personally. They weren't thinking, oh, what does this mean about me that I'm with you? It was more like, I'm with you and I'm sticking it out because that's what I'm supposed to do, even if I don't like you. But I'm doing the right thing, staying with you. All the rules have changed, and we got our wishes, and we don't know what's wrong. So that's what I think is, let's say, the dilemma or the paradox of love in the 21st century. Dialogue therapy began in 1980 as a result of my partner and husband and best friend of that time, Ed Epstein, and I working together to integrate psychodrama and a lot of the dramatic, challenging aspects of psychodrama into a therapy situation in which the two members of the couple were engaged with each other instead of with a therapist as a third element. It was designed as a co-therapist model, two therapists in the room, as a way of having really the way of surrounding the couple, not that each partner had a therapist companion. It was in 2015 that I began to bring back dialogue therapy in a revised form, and have written a new book called True Love Ways, which is a book to introduce it to couples and also to therapists. But I've also designed a new course using the framework of either the co-therapist or the solo therapist model to bring dialogue therapy back to professionals who could be introduced to it through the course, and then over time can be supervised and develop it in their practice. Okay, so this is our second meeting after the evaluation, and it'll be our first meeting of dialogue therapy, where we're actually practicing the skills that you learned about in our first meeting, or you got the handout for anyway. And we will be doing that in a way that involves Jeannie and I in several different roles. And I'll explain the role of coaching, and you can explain then maybe alter ego, and then we'll come back to the dialogue. So sometimes Jeannie and I will talk to each other. Sometimes we'll talk about what you've said to us. And sometimes I will speak to you like this. I'll lean over, and I might even tap you and say, talk to me for a moment. Mm-hmm. And I'll be coaching you on something. If I think that it's really involved and that I need to talk to you in greater detail, I'll switch chairs with you, Katie. So in that role, I will be your coach. And then we have another role that we use, which Jeannie's going to talk about.
And this is the role of us in alter ego or doubling state. And so what we'll do in that situation is, if Katie's talking about something that has some emotional content to it, and I feel like the emotion itself is obfuscated somehow, I'm going to try and speak for her to you. So I will speak as her, and I'll speak directly to you, Will. And Katie can say to me, yes, that's right. No, that's not quite right. I'm going to alter it in this way. I'm going to play with it, and you can respond to whatever we've come up with that way. Polly will do the same with you. So she'll speak through you to Katie, and you can tweak it in any way that doesn't feel right to you. But if it feels like it's accurate, you can just stay with it. Mm-hmm. And Katie will respond to you with Polly's words.
Dialogue therapy puts together the partners being emotionally activated, bringing insight into their own unconscious fantasies, internal theater, the roles that they've set out for themselves and their partner, with ability to actually stop and take in what's going on and work with one's own feelings and thoughts.
I hear you saying that your ability to follow your desires and to be what you are is like really important to you. And I'm getting lost again.
You have a hard time doing this because it's hitting something in you that you don't want to feel. And that's why then you forget what it is, partly. So I feel like on the fence sort of with that
subject that I'm like I'm half that and I'm half like the practical side of me.
Yeah, I'm gonna change seats
So,
with you.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Hi.
Right.
So you had a very hard time taking in what Katie was saying. Even when you paraphrased that, after I paraphrased it a couple of times, you left out some of the essence of it. So you were saying that you have a hard time hearing it because it does something to you. I mean, I can tell you're activated by it on a feeling level.
Yeah.
Do you know anything about the feelings that it stirs up in you?
Not right now.
Dialogue, in the way that we talk about it in dialogue therapy, is a particular form of conversation. And it's a form of conversation that you would use when you're in a time of emotional conflict. It's very, very useful in a conflict. And dialogue is also useful when you're out in the world and you're having a challenging moment with somebody. So dialogue is the capacity and the skill to speak for yourself in I statements. That means not using we, not using you, but I'm having this experience, this is how I see it, this is what's going on with me. And then also being able to paraphrase through something that's often called active listening, where you're able to say to your partner, here's what I'm understanding of what you just said.
So around that topic, I sometimes feel that I am working a lot and you are not, and that I therefore have less time and energy to pursue the things I want to pursue, both on my own and with you. Yeah, that's pretty much the crux of it.
So, I guess I'll paraphrase. I hear you saying that you are. I put you in a position, or you're in a position where you feel like you do too much in a way that isn't working for you, that doesn't support you in pursuing the things that are most important to you.
It's the attempt to step into that person's point of view on the world, that person's emotional reality, and to say, here's what I understand your experience to be like from what you've told me. And in order to do that, when you're emotionally activated, you have to have some mindfulness skills. You have to be able to step back and to reflect and to breathe deeply and to accept what's going on. Dialogue therapy introduces the deep compassion of being able to see somebody through the thick and the thin of it, and to be able to remain interested even when that person brings you pain. And I think most of us really, really want to be able to do that with our loved ones, but it is very, very difficult to do. And if people can do it with their partners, with their grown children, with the people that are in their families, they certainly can take that kind of skill outside of the family and use it where it's much easier to use, actually. Dialogue therapy exemplifies some way of bringing compassion and clarity and equanimity to the challenges of the world. So that's the kind of overview, and I'm going to go into a little more detail about some of these things now. I just wanted to say that the book was called True Love Ways, and now it's called Love Between Equals. The publisher changed the title from the Buddy Holly song called True Love Ways. But I think Love Between Equals is really a good title because it is what I'm talking about. So are you with me? Is this making sense? I hope it's the reason why you came. If it's not, let me know. I'll try it on another channel then. But I'm gonna read to you now a little while about looking at some of the background of what I was talking about in the video. So I think that love in the 21st century has beckoned us to a new cultural and social horizon from which we may be able to learn how to manage our conflicts between love and hate, between dominance and submission, between surrender and self-protection, without creating an enemy. Either we will learn how to grow and develop in this way, or our narcissistic longings for a perfect love will defeat us. So I actually am doing all the work that I'm doing in dialogue therapy right now and trying to take it out to communities, because I do think that contemporary couple relationship has created an urgent and critical challenge to the stability of our families and our lives. And I want this challenge to lead to a greater wisdom instead of a failure to love. I will come back to those ideas later if you want to ask about them, because I do believe that we are on a kind of critical edge in regard to narcissism in our society. And I don't see other cultures going in the direction we're going. So it does make me wonder about how we've gotten ourselves into the loop we're in. But one of the ways that I think we can proceed is to learn how to love the people around us. And so when I'm talking about couples, also think of yourself with your adult children, because you're equals once your children grow up. And how do you communicate? And how do you get through a conflict? If you have parents that are alive still, you're equals with your parents once you're an adult. And again, how do you go through conflict with your parents? Before we can learn to love under the current conditions, we need to reflect a bit on our past traditions. Marriage has relatively quickly moved from being a vow of impersonal loyalty and a commitment in sickness and in health until death do us part, for the sake of the family and the property, to a personal and transitory vow for as long as this meets my needs. That's the vow that people take now. This shift has made everyone a little nervous, and some people now feel almost obliged to break off a relationship if they no longer find their own image and values reflected in the other person in the way they expect. They say to themselves, like, how can I be with someone like this? Further, because ideals of hierarchy are eschewed in our contemporary lives, our relationships are based on ideals of equality and reciprocity, as well as personal desire. Equality, mutuality, reciprocity, and desire are destabilizing influences in a partnership or a family because of the ongoing requirements to negotiate needs and conflicts on a day-to-day or even an hour-to-hour basis. Frequent and repetitive negotiations require emotional and communication skills that most of us lack. Our ordinary daily conflicts can soon become exhausting and dispiriting because no solutions are arrived at. And I think here about having dinner with a family these days where there are children in the family, and how many negotiations there are about food, about types of food, about whether people are going to stay at the table or not, and what the bedtime is going to be, and whether they're going to watch their devices or be allowed to have screen time. Almost everything is negotiated. There are very few policies that are set down because of the absence of hierarchy, even in parenting. So it makes sometimes those family dinners kind of unlikable, to say the least. So these conflicts, even the most benign ones like what color should we paint the kitchen, may threaten to undermine our commitment to relationships because they quickly lead us to review whether or not we want to live with someone like this. And on top of all this, human beings, that is, Homo sapiens, may unfortunately, despite our best intentions, simply feel more comfortable and at ease in hierarchy in which one individual seems to be in charge. Then the power arrangements are clear, even if they rest on oppression and potentially abuse. So it's possible that Homo sapiens are simply more comfortable in hierarchy than with all of these negotiations all the time. But in today's world, you most likely believe that you no longer want hierarchy in your personal life. You want to be an equal with your partner and to be respected, and you want to be witnessed and held in mind. And you want to be found desirable and cared for. These are the demands of personal love. This love is different from romance and from biological attachment bonds. Personal love is much more demanding and challenging than a secure attachment or pair bond because it typically requires functioning together with a partner in multiple roles in our daily lives and using psychological insights and even spiritual skills that are unfamiliar and can seem burdensome. Attachment bonds and biology play a role in personal love, but only a minor role. Living together over time and solving problems with someone who is meant to be your best friend, your co-parent, your sexual partner, and possibly your business partner, in a reciprocal and mutual relationship is a radical new endeavor for which the old archetypes and myths, as well as the current neurological and biological models, do not provide adequate guidance. In today's marriage, and I'll use the term marriage loosely here to mean a long-term committed bond, you fall in love with a stranger to whom you then commit in a relationship in which you promise not to dominate, control, or break the trust. Furthermore, you must also remain true to yourself, your own needs and values, or the relationship will not thrive. Personal love, as we will see, breaks all the rules that marriage has followed for centuries. Most radically, this kind of love requires an emotional and mental space in which both partners can grow and develop psychologically and spiritually. And this process begins with disillusionment after the romance has ended. So let's see. So here's a little summary of what I'm saying. So while disillusionment is the death knell for romance, it is a necessary development for personal love to mature. Here's a radical idea. When you fall in love, you have fallen into your own unconsciousness. And you can only step out of that unconsciousness after you begin to see what you have projected, both in idealization and in disillusionment. So falling in love is like a mutually idealizing projection. It's intoxicating. And when someone falls in love with you, you get back an idealized picture of yourself in that mirror, in that emotional mirror. And when you fall in love with somebody else, you idealize that person. In other words, you set them on a pedestal. They're above the ordinary people in terms of the ways that they make you feel or what they promise to you. So when that goes both ways, it's kind of like a psychotic delusion. I mean, it's really off the charts in terms of the way you imagine things are going to be. And then, of course, the only thing that can happen is reality. And the two people have to fall off the pedestal, and then they have to go on from there. And so disillusionment, the disillusioning of your ideals, is the beginning of love. That's the beginning. The falling in love is the beginning of romance. And of course, people in our culture, they want the romance. Disillusionment is critically important on the path of love because it is the first opportunity to notice your projection after it has become sour and negative, when your partner begins to seem like someone you don't like and you must defend against. I mean, naturally, as long as the idealization is mutual, you feel great about yourself, you feel great about the other person. You know, what's wrong with that? It's only after things get to be negative that you realize maybe you didn't see this person, accurately. Maybe you don't know this person very well. You then must develop as the next step a more complex picture of your partner and yourself that includes your projected anxieties, images, and desires. The truth is that this other person cannot satisfy all or maybe even most of your needs to be your friend in all the ways you had hoped. Embracing this truth again and again in a way that does not prohibit intimacy and friendship with your partner is an ongoing commitment. The process of taking back our projections never ends. It means you have to maintain a kind of psychological openness that helps you repeatedly get to know your partner anew and to look at yourself with fresh eyes. For personal love to develop into what I call true love, a powerful mixture, which is a powerful mixture of reality and desire. Somebody once said that true love teaches reality to desire. You must shift from disillusionment into friendship, from antagonism into cooperation, from your partner being your intimate enemy into becoming your intimate friend. As a result, it requires you to discover and embrace a more complex sense of who you are, your history, vulnerabilities, and so on, since these are the basis of both your idealizations and your disillusionments. Do you get that? So it's really the requirement of you becoming more complex to yourself. The defenses that surround the pain of disillusionment often keep couples from moving into being intimate after feeling like enemies. Partners and their friends and relatives also tend to make critical appraisals of a devalued partner, such as, he's an alcoholic, she's needy, he's got bipolar, she's an airhead. These are the kinds of things that go around once disillusionment starts happening. These appraisals lead to gathering evidence and grievances to illustrate their circumstantial truths. And so disavowed aggressions and feelings of moral superiority of victimhood complicate many daily conflicts with proof that a devalued partner is defective or mean-spirited. True love, however, requires walking through that disillusionment without losing your faith and hope of finding your best friend again through a fog of confusion, discouragement, and pain. Sadly, it is at the juncture of defensive disillusionment where most committed couples flounder and become discouraged and feel imprisoned. It is at this point where traditional marriages typically lost their way and entered into the war between the sexes. That's where most traditional marriages from the past remained. They remained in a war zone, the war between the sexes. Learning to navigate the path from disillusionment to true love is what dialogue therapy is about, and also what I'm about in many ways. So, well, let's talk a little bit about love and marriage. The contemporary practice of freely choosing someone to be your life partner has spurred a quiet revolution. Since marriage became a legal institution in 12th century Europe, until about 50 years ago, our social and religious practices required marital partners to be committed not to a personal relationship, but to a contract and an institution. Marriage was for procreating and raising children, and for protecting wealth and other resources in a family over generations. Arranged marriages were the norm until the 18th century, and still are the norm in many societies that embrace hierarchy in the home. When marriage was essentially a business arrangement and male ownership, marked by the man's family name going down over the generations, was part of the larger cultural marketplace, marriage was not about pleasure per se, nor did it have the connotations of personal development with which it is now viewed. In the traditional patriarchal model of marriage, there is a hierarchy of power. Someone makes the decisions and someone else follows orders. Depending on the society, it may be that the man makes the decisions inside and outside the home, or that the man makes the decisions outside the home while the woman makes them inside. Partners are not encouraged, sometimes not even allowed, to make decisions jointly, nor are they encouraged to be too interested in each other. Why is this? If they're too wrapped up with each other, they might forget to protect the family resources and care for the young. You know, in the past also, women were pregnant on an average of 15 times in their adult life, and they, out of those 15 pregnancies, probably produced between 5 and 10 actual living adult children. So there was a lot of preoccupation with reproduction and childcare from the woman's side, and the man was to support that activity. That is not to say that sexual pair bonding cannot produce pleasure, the feeling of connection, or even intimacy under these circumstances, but reciprocity and mutuality are not expected or even encouraged to develop. When political, social, and economic realities are the cultural underpinnings of marriage, empires can rise and fall in relation to these underpinnings. Think, for example, of King Henry VIII of England. Personal love and attraction between individuals is then a dangerous threat when it becomes a central part of marriage. Outside of marriage, it is more tolerable. Romantic love and sexual liaisons have always been pursued outside of the business of marriage by the wealthiest and the stealthiest. It was in the late 18th century when these romantic ideals and possibilities for love began to enter the popular imagination in a new way in the West. Instead of pursuing romantic love outside marriage, people began to long for romantic love inside of marriage. The idea of personal choice of a partner based on attraction began first in poetry, philosophy, and art, and then, starting around the end of the 19th century in the West, people began to feel that choosing a partner was a personal right, no matter their background or that of their beloved. That is, falling in love became a reason or an impetus for people of differing classes, religions, races, sexual orientations, and backgrounds to marry and spend their lives together. However, this romantic ideal was at odds with and ill-suited to the religious, social, and legal underpinnings of an institution like marriage that had been designed to conserve resources and family identity over generations. Having your marital partner chosen for you by an elder, such as a parent or a grandparent, meant you would marry a suitable partner from your own tribe, someone from the same religious or class background, who had adequate social and financial capital. Falling in love with Cupid's arrow arbitrarily striking your heart, which was kind of the image of Cupid, the god Eros in his immature form, shooting at individuals to make them fall in love. It just seemed crazy and arbitrary, and it made no sense for traditional marriage that you would go in that direction. I mean, it made sense to pursue that outside of marriage, but not inside of marriage. As sociologist Stephanie Kuntz says in her book, Marriage, a History, How Love Conquered Marriage, quote, when the idea that love should be the central reason for marriage and companionship its basic goal was first raised, observers of the day warned that the same values that increased people's satisfaction with marriage as a relationship had an inherent tendency to undermine the stability of marriage as an institution. End of quote. Marrying for love has indeed made marriage more fragile. As a commitment or a bond, modern marriage seems weaker than ever before. More than 50% of first-time marriages overall, this is sort of an averaging out over the years, more than 50% of first-time marriages and about 65% of remarriages on average end in divorce. Marriage no longer even promises a stable environment for raising children. In the family life cycle, couples break apart most often when they have children younger than school age and then after the children leave home. Those are the two times in the family life cycle. In the first instance, there is a greater pressure on the couple for cooperation, decision-making, and sharing of tasks than before children arrive. The critical demands of infants and young children can make conflicts between partners more desperate and acrimonious, especially when partners may be juggling jobs or careers and financial pressures. On the other hand, after children leave home, there is less of a feeling of obligation for the parents to stay together and more of a space for reflection and consideration of the dynamics of the couple. When marriages break up late in life, individuals, especially women, may sustain devastating financial losses. In my psychotherapy practice, I see many older women who find themselves alone after years of, as they would say, conforming to others' needs, suffering now from loneliness and feelings of failure. In some European countries now, it has become a common practice for partners not to marry in order to raise children, because there is an assumption that the adult bond has a higher than equal chance of falling apart after children are born. And so why enter into legal constraints when you can predict the marriage is unlikely to last? So the idea of separating marriage and raising children has come into play because children put an extra pressure on the marriage. So why not just not marry if you're going to have children? When marriage was about raising children, conserving and expanding wealth, and obeying commandments, things were simpler in some ways. If you needed love or romance, you could look outside your marriage, or possibly you would try to bury your needs in an addiction or ignore your desires for happiness. Now, in an age where you can expect love between equals, you do not have to turn to deception or self-abnegation, but you are instead faced with the challenges that personal love brings, the necessity of developing new psychological and spiritual skills, and the recognition that you have some responsibility for your own happiness. Of course, there are still many people who stay in unhappy marriages because they're afraid of divorce. When I hear an older couple say loudly and proudly, "We've been married for 50 years," I don't necessarily think, well, that must have taken a lot of psychological and spiritual maturity to accomplish. In other words, my first thought is not, wow, great, you guys must be really well developed. Instead, I find myself wondering whether they follow the old institutional model in which divorce is not an option. For example, at a poignant moment in a film about Beatle George Harrison, who apparently had a lot of extramarital affairs, not a surprise, someone asked his wife, "What is the secret to a long marriage?" And her answer was, "Don't divorce." When marriages are traditional social contracts, couples are not expected to live in an atmosphere of give and take in which they want to become best friends and interlocutors together. Instead, spouses promise to sustain their bonds in sickness and in health, with the goal of overcoming their personal feelings and preferences. Until the second half of the 20th century, traditional husbands and wives did not expect to be friends. Most women had female friends and the support of their extended family, and men had male friends and work and religious colleagues. In the best of circumstances, spouses simply did not have high hopes of being known and seen and understood by each other. In the worst of circumstances, there was violence, depression, abuse, and addiction hidden inside a marriage that might look proper or stable from the outside. Women and children typically took the brunt of the aggression since they were financially and socially dependent on the marriage. With these dependencies, women did not feel free to leave a marriage, but now they initiate leaving slightly more often than men do. Now both women and men can make a living wage and support themselves and share support for their offspring, even after they separate or divorce. This shift has made a big change in marriage. Gay, lesbian, and transgendered coupling has also become more the norm, offering a further challenge to the idea of a traditional marriage. And today, everyone expects to be treated with respect. Partners also expect to be autonomous. They want to make their own choices and decisions. More important, they want to be embraced and recognized as individuals. They want to be seen and witnessed for their strengths and supported in their limitations. No one wants to be dominated by someone else's control or criticism. Being under, I'll go to that. Being under someone else's thumb is not part of being an autonomous adult. It is the opposite of a relationship which values respect, equality, and reciprocity. And so personal love in marriage requires a whole new set of skills and insights. It demands a readiness to develop as an individual, which can be a frightening idea and a challenging reality for many people. Personal love requires partners to change their views of themselves, to develop an ability to tolerate conflict and negotiate differences, to take responsibility for their own emotional habits, and to be open to new insights about their partners. It is the development of these skills which is the focus of dialogue therapy and of the path that I call the spiritual path of love in the 21st century. Fundamentally, when marriage shifted from being a hierarchical institution into a personal and equal arrangement, it changed the meaning of both marriage and divorce. Wanting a partner who gets you and affirms you, someone who can be a witness and a friend over time, means that staying in an unhappy marriage now feels like you are being untrue to yourself. Marriage has shifted from a loyalty to a family identity into a loyalty to your personal identity. For many people, this desire for witnessing from a partner has also meant an exclusive focus on the intimate relationship for solace and friendship, often at the expense of other friendships and relationships outside of the partnership. As a result of all of the above, staying in an unhappy marriage can lead to seriously diminished psychological, social, and physical functioning for an individual. In other words, staying in an unhappy marriage now makes people sick. It makes them psychologically and physically sick. Staying in an unhappy marriage now makes people sick, it says here, and it creates an undermining of self-esteem. Considering all this, our high divorce rate can be seen as a sign of health, in that people feel better when they get out of the conditions of personal wounding instead of staying in them for the sake of appearances. Some psychological and social pundits have suggested that we've placed too many demands on marriage. I think instead that we're still uninformed and deeply confused about what is required for personal love to succeed and become true love. As our circumstances and needs have changed over the centuries, we have dramatically transformed marriage, but we have not transformed ourselves within it. Instead, we have mistakenly focused and almost obsessively on the idea of making a good match or fulfilling the ideal for right chemistry, for good chemistry. I'm looking for someone, everybody says to me when they're looking for someone, doesn't the chemistry have to be good? You know, as though that's gonna mean something. That good chemistry thing means very little in the long run, but it does get you through the door. It's sexual attraction as the basis for a happy marriage. We've also become confused about what having a commitment means. Some tend to treat commitment as a prison, while others idealize it and assume it should be a paradise in which all conflicts or differences will just magically dissolve. We are also unskilled in negotiating conflicts with an equal whom we cannot dominate or control. We may refuse to take responsibility for our own feelings and experiences, demand the submission of our partner, or take a submissive role ourselves. Most critically, we want to fall in love, but we do not understand or endorse the necessary process of disillusionment that must follow from the romantic beginning. We want the expansion of the romance, but not the contraction of the disillusionment and the loss of idealization of our partner. Romantic love brings an expansive and enlivening feeling that necessarily leads, if you stay together as a couple, to an opposite contractive feeling of disappointment or disillusionment. However, by transforming your disillusionment into friendship, compassion, and self-acceptance, you bring about a new and lasting intimacy that rests on an intersubjective space, what I call a mindful space, between you and your partner, and guarantees you will develop as individuals. This requires learning to work with the reality of the self and the reality of the partner on an ongoing and transformative way. Simply put, Personal love invites you to live a more conscious life and to become a psychological individual who functions as a grown-up. As Carl Jung said in 1925 in an essay called Marriage as a Psychological Relationship, it's a very prescient essay for 1925, he says, "Seldom or never does a marriage develop into an individual relationship smoothly and without crises. There is no birth of consciousness without pain." That's the end of the quote. When you can allow disillusionment to be the necessary fall from romance, you can then expand your awareness of what it means to be a conscious human being, coming to know both yourself and your beloved more deeply. As a result, you deepen your sense of compassion for the human condition. And in these ways, your relationship can become a vehicle for spiritual growth. So I'm going to just show a couple of slides on true love, and then we'll have some conversation about all of this. I want to make just one more remark about the human condition. Since I don't have a lot of time to talk with you about what it means that we are barely conscious. So we are about 95% unconscious, because our working memory only really works for about 5% of what we actually experience. And human consciousness is the capacity to know what you're experiencing. It's like knowing what you're feeling, knowing what you're hearing, knowing what you're seeing. And our capacity to do that, it rests on our ability to actually see and remember what we did experience. So just like we have about 95% of the universe is dark matter, about 95% of our personality and our activities and so on is fairly dark to us. So we need others in order to see ourselves. So here we are as human beings, profoundly unconscious, profoundly interdependent, profoundly unconscious, profoundly interdependent. So we suffer tremendously from our desire to be loved and to be seen. It is probably the biggest challenge in human life and the one that we fail at most frequently. If we truly understood that, as Leonard Cohen says, if we knew that love is not a victory march, and it's inherently broken, it's inherently a failure for everybody. It never works out well. Nobody gets a free lunch. The only way for it to work out well is for somebody to die before the disillusionment happens, It's like the reason that Marilyn Monroe always looks so good. She died so young, So if you're going to go through the process of loving somebody, you are going to fail in all sorts of ways. If you know that, you develop compassion for yourself and the other person and the other people around you. You no longer are mostly judging them. You're mostly trying to understand and help. So this issue of being profoundly interdependent and profoundly unconscious is a very, very big issue for human beings. So here is what develops from personal love if you follow the spiritual path from disillusionment to intimacy, is what I call true love. And of course, it is not like you arrive at it and then you can just take your tent down and go home. It's like it's a constant involvement with recognizing who you are, what you're projecting, who the other is, making a space in which that can occur, listening carefully, being interested. And it results in knowing the beloved well, accepting the beloved as he or she is in reality. Now, there's a whole lecture in that, accepting the beloved as he or she is in reality. I have a son who's in his 40s. He became a libertarian, and he voted for Trump after voting for Obama and being in a very liberal family. Now, I had a choice. I could make some judgment or say what other people said in the family, he must be going crazy, what's wrong with him, was losing his mind. Or I could be interested. Why did he do that? And it was difficult to be interested. But I went that direction. I said, okay, tell me, show me the videos, show me this stuff. I learned a lot. I learned a lot. It really changed my views of the world by going through that with him. So accepting the other, ultimately you want to accept your beloved without wanting to change a hair. Now, how do you get to that? You get to that by learning how to work with yourself and working with your own feelings, your own prejudices, your own opinions, noticing that, oh my gosh, yeah, maybe I am a little rigid there. Maybe I'm not open. Maybe I think of myself as open-minded, but I'm not really very open-minded, and so on and so forth. So accepting the beloved as he or she is in reality, not the idealized thing, is a very big challenge. Then holding your beloved in mind means that you actually give thought to this person even when you're not with them. You begin to think about, oh, I wonder, what the other person might like or want or desire. You think about that, you bring it to mind, you talk about it, and remaining interested and engaged over time through the changes of impermanence. Now, in Love Between Equals, I talk a lot about how partners diagnose each other these days in therapy. I mean, it really is a phenomenon. People come in and say, I think my husband has borderline personality, or narcissistic personality, or he has ADD, or she's an airhead. That's not exactly a diagnosis, but it'll usually be along the lines of bipolar, something like that. Most people don't say, I think my partner is depressed anymore. It's usually like a personality disorder, and they've heard about it on television or something. But they don't even describe what they don't like. They just try to summarize it in a diagnosis. And believe me, you cannot remain interested in the other person if you summarize the other person in a diagnosis. That will eliminate all your interest. So one thing about remaining interested is remaining open to the complexity. Sometimes people say, my father was an alcoholic, when they come into therapy and I'm asking them about their past. And I usually say, did he do anything else? What was he like? What was in his life? I mean, people do not specialize in being alcoholics. They have something else going on in life. So true love depends on mutual, reciprocal, egalitarian relationship that becomes both mysterious and familiar. If you actually feel at ease with your partner, you will notice over time you don't know that person as well as you thought. And as you go into your interest in the person as the person changes, you're like, wow, that person's kind of mysterious. I didn't know that, or this, or that, or that. Coming to dialogue therapy, people hear their partners interviewed, and they hear the partner talk about the history of the relationship. And recently, I was sitting across from a woman and interviewing her while her partner was sitting behind and taking notes. And I said, so, where did you meet him and why did you fall in love? And she said, oh, I never fell in love with him. And he had never heard that before. And I said, you didn't? And she said, no. She said, no, I met him under these circumstances and it seemed convenient to get married. And so I never fell in love with him. So there was a whole thing to unpack there. I mean, she'd been married to him for, I don't know, they've been married for 40-some years, But in the past, people didn't fall in love to get married. It's not a necessity to fall in love to get married. But it was interesting to her and to him that we could talk about this. So he became to her, hearing her, she became to him more mysterious. These capacities that I'm talking about here also depend on a certain degree of mindfulness, some capacity for empathy, equanimity, which is the sense of remaining kind of warm toward your experience, not totally warm, but having a friendly attitude toward your experience, no matter what's going on. It's like being relaxed with your own feelings, with your own pain. That's equanimity. So they require mindfulness, empathy, equanimity, emotional maturity. Emotional maturity really means your capacity to take responsibility for yourself and to recognize that nobody causes you to be angry, no one causes you to get violent. I mean, if somebody were actually threatening your life, yes, they are causing it there. But most of the time, our reactivity is a result of our own narratives, our own images, our own associations that we're putting into the mix, and then we're feeling angry, or then we're feeling upset, or whatever. So emotional maturity, open communication, and truth-telling. So truth-telling also plays a big role in long-term intimacy. And that is also a skill, because the truth is never obvious, and all of us lie. All of us lie to some degree or another all of the time. So in order to get to something like the truth, which sustains people over time, you really have to learn how to speak about your experience. There's in Buddhism a kind of basic speech practice, which is that before you speak, you ask yourself, what I'm about to say, is it true? Like, in other words, is it pretty much what I take to be true? Is it kind? Am I saying it in a kind way? And is it necessary to say it? So just when you pause and you check with yourself, and I will say it to myself like this, I want to speak the truth kindly, but I want to say only what's necessary. Now, I usually fail on the third one. I usually say a lot that's not necessary, but my adult children have been teaching me to say less and less because they're not interested in what I say. And so I pare it down. But, it is true that if you can check yourself before you speak, it's easier to tell the truth, because then you're able to put it into a way of speaking which the other person might be able to digest, to hear. So all of these things go into this path of true love, which is an ongoing path, and if you get skilled at it, you can take it out into the other parts of life. It doesn't stay in your family. It goes out to deal with conflicts in the community. It goes out to deal with differences on many, many levels. So, so that's the talk, and I hope that we can talk about it now. And so I'm open for comments or questions or yes.
Okay, you're talking about egalitarianism and maturity enough to treat someone as an equal. What do you do with dependency issues? Because in my family, I had parent and sibling that basically never grew up.
Yeah.
And you cannot have equality when you're dependent on someone, can you?
Well, let me say, first of all, the way I'm talking about true love, it does require the equality, mutuality, reciprocity. However, there are other kinds of love. So true love, let's say, is going to probably occupy a very small part of your life. And then there are other kinds of love. And in the book, I talk about something called cherishing, which is love on a one-way street. Love on a one-way street might be where you become a witness and you hold them in mind, but it's not reciprocal. It's not reciprocated. But you still enjoy the cherishing because you enjoy that kind of engagement. That is very different also from taking care of somebody's needs resentfully, which is another option. So there are a lot of different options in regard to your affection, care, or love for the others around you. Cherishing also takes some of these skills and the recognition that you have to accept the non-reciprocity. So sometimes our adult children give us practice in this area. You know, they're not much interested in us, but we remain interested in them, right? And I sort of feel like I'm a baby boomer, and I sort of feel like I had to practice that non-reciprocated cherishing to my parents, and I have to with my children as well, and it's only been with my partner that I, have actually had the reciprocal, the true love path. So yeah, there are different kinds of love, and this kind of love I'm talking about, which is the love I think people want in marriage. They want it in their long-term committed relationships. It's the kind of love that requires the highest degree of psychological and spiritual skill, because it really is, when it works, it's amazing. It's like you feel at home on earth. which is not easy to do. But when it doesn't work, sometimes you have to do one of these other kinds of love, or you simply, grit your teeth and just do your obligations. But that's not really love. I don't think that was ever what love was really supposed to be, just obligations. So is that a good answer? Does that make sense? Somebody else? Anyone else have any questions? Yes.
You talked at the beginning about a mirror to your partner that reflects two different things. One is truth-telling and one is loving, warm regard for the other person. How do you help couples balance that or find a way to do both in the right proportion?
Well, first of all, the two components really are the ways that you reflect in a positive way, but also the way you reflect the limitations of the other person. In other words, with a partner, you do need to be able to reflect to them where you see them falling off a cliff or where you're pained by what they're doing and so on. So it's a matter of being able to speak to the other person and to convey emotionally an image of the other person that is good enough that the person recognizes it as, yes, that's me, you see me, and also bearable enough that the other person can learn from it. If you're reflecting back to the other person something like, you're just a mean-spirited, nasty being, that isn't going to be helpful to the other person. They're going to pull away from that negative image. It's too negative. But if you feed back instead some sense of, I understand that pain that you feel, and yet if you speak to me in this way, or you speak to our children in this way, or whatever, it's not working. It's not getting you where you want to go. So that's a mirror, let's say, of that person's faults, but it might be a tolerable mirror. All of the things that have to do with witnessing do have to be checked out, and you do have to have some degree of wisdom in the way you speak. I find that the couples that I work with in therapy, and I'm going back to doing mostly couples therapy now, they often speak to each other. They begin to speak as a we, like we want more intimacy, or we have a good time together. And I usually break that right away. But there's no we, especially in times of conflict. There are two people, and they're different, and they're adults, and they're autonomous. And if you want to speak in a we way, you should check it out with your partner. Because often what happens is one person starts speaking, and let's say she thinks that she's speaking about something in a nice tone, and she's just giving a little feedback or whatever, and the other person says, wait a minute, I don't have that point of view at all. And because she has said we, that person stopped listening and started defending, that doesn't include me, that's not me. So starting with an I, like I see it this way, or I'm approaching it like this, or I feel this way, or I'm having this experience, or this is my impression. All of those things are, even as a first step towards a mirroring, they are more skillful than starting with a you or a we, unless you're in a wonderful, passionate moment, or everything's just hunky-dory. Then you can use anything almost in speech, and it's fine. But in times of conflict, or where you're trying to give feedback for something that you feel the other person is doing that's hurtful, it's very important then to speak for yourself, speak in I statements, and after you've spoken, check out whether the other person has understood. Ask them to paraphrase, summarize what you've said before they respond to it. Because, listen, 95% unconscious. We are terrible eyewitnesses. And most of us do not think that's true, especially when it comes to our partners. I have heard so many people argue endlessly about what happened in a 5-minute period where each person saw it very, very differently. And they don't seem to realize that that's the human way of experiencing things. We don't know what happened in that 5-minute period. We only have our own feelings, our own impressions, our own ideas, and I don't recommend installing a video camera in your living room or putting a chip in the back of your brain so you can record everything that everybody says to you, because that's not the essence of life. The essence of life really is that it is vital and alive, and it does pass quickly, and it is impermanent, and you don't remember it well, so be a little modest. Say what your experience is, check out whether the other person even understands your words, and then find out what their experience was. So all of that's involved in mirroring, and once you get good at mirroring also, what you notice is that the other person can tolerate your feedback. They're not so defensive. They're not defending. You can check yourself out, If you're not good at that, when you try to give feedback, the first response is the person's going to defend themselves, because we're also universally interested in defending ourselves. We're self-protective, and that doesn't change from one person to another, no matter what culture you came from or whatever. And we're interested in power. We check out where we are in the group really quickly. And it's the same with a couple. So that's a long answer, but you opened a door to something. I hope I answered your question in that. So all of these things that I'm talking about that are the basis for true love do require skill, and people are sneaking out, and so probably my time is up. And if there's anything else that you want to ask, is there something, did you have a question in the back?
Thank you. I heard you say about how people lose curiosity when they pathologize.
Yes.
And in a way, I almost heard you diagnose our sort of the way society is as narcissistic.
Yes.
So when you've lost your interest.
No, it does not. No, it's just that we are at this point so concerned about our personal feelings that it's hard for us sometimes to get past that, to have any feeling of interest in what's happening outside of how we feel about it. And so in a couple relationship, what I find that happens is that I think that people spend a lot of time looking for a partner to get the right partner, and then they could throw that partner away pretty quickly because they don't realize the amount of skill that it takes to stay with somebody over time, to remain engaged and interested, and especially to have that spark, that vitality, which is part of life. There's a lot more to this that gets a little bit more psychological, but let me just say it like this, that if communication between people over time feels dead, if it feels primarily dead, there is a problem then that the two people are so unable to actually see each other or feel the presence of each other that they have subjugated their communication entirely to unconscious projections and assignment of meaning. And to me, that is the biggest sign of narcissism, when you subjugate everything to your own feelings and you're just not interested in anything that goes outside of your feelings. And I'm not saying that as a diagnosis of today's couples, actually. I think that that is a suffering. It's a terrible suffering because you feel so alienated. You feel so isolated. You feel like you're stuck with your own experience, even if you've got a partner there. So, I'm using the term narcissism really in just as a way of elaborating the idea that love today is very personal. People take it personally, they're looking for their personal needs, and they don't want to stay in it unless their personal needs are met. And that leads to a whole lot of things. But let me just make this one last remark. Infidelity is not a matter, generally speaking, of sexual attraction as much as it is a matter of a person feeling deadened in their primary relationship and then feeling some sort of vitality outside of it. And that vitality wakes them up, they feel alive. And that's the motivation for infidelity. So if the primary relationship is deadened you're really set up there for finding life outside of that. So again, looking at this issue of our personal desires, we want to use these desires to find our partners. We want to find partners that appeal to us personally. Now we need to learn to develop the skills to stay in those relationships over time, or we will be, in the end, alone and isolated and maybe alienated and lots of other things. So that's where the narcissism bit comes in. Does that make sense? Yeah. Okay, thank you, folks. It was nice being with you.